if Russia and the West, get along with each other, which is what they seemed to get along in the 90s. So that gave us a chance to open up to everyone. Therefore, for India, would like to see US and Russia get along or have a reasonable accommodation. So that will reduce a lot of pressure on India and increase its room for maneuver.
In this week's Raja Mandala, you've taken a old but new topic, Russia, US, China to an extent, but mostly India, and how there's a rebalancing or there's a negotiation happening post the tensions in Ukraine between the West and Russia over the sort of security architecture and future in Europe and the lines that are being drawn there. So an interesting thing that you point out is that, and you've said this in the past in other columns as well, that China, for example, is now the bigger threat to, or the bigger adversary or the bigger issue for the US, the West, as well as India. Of course, we share a huge contested border with them. Do you think that the US, what started with Trump was in one sense a less interventionist role, is something he was championing, that there is a continuity that in that, especially vis-a-vis Europe, that appetite for being a net security provider or taking on sort of something like the Ukraine crisis, what they're saying, Russia's whole thing with the expansion of NATO, is that even a Biden administration realizes that this may not be the time, or that even the American system and people don't have the appetite for that kind of expansion anymore, or that kind of role, not expansion perhaps.
I think the European security issues, of course, was a basket entirely on its own. I mean, it's different from the interventions in the Middle East, etc. Because this was a core commitment that the US had made after the Second World War to support the European allies. And then when the Cold War ended, in fact, the column was also partly to commemorate the collapse of the Soviet Union 30 years ago, that there was an opportunity to rethink the structure. But the US, started expanding NATO, which caused huge concerns in the post-Soviet Russia. And while Russia seemed to initially accept it, but I think once Putin took charge in 1999, he said, look, they began this massive campaign against the Western expansion of NATO alliance. One, they covered some of the old Warsaw Pact countries. Then they started inching closer and closer to the Russia's new borders. So I think what Russia has shown in the last few years is that they're not going to simply accept it. I mean, they've annexed Crimea, they've intervened in Georgia. So I think they're saying that, look, we need a new understanding, that you don't come too close, I won't do the nasty things. So let's work this out. So what has happened is that while Trump tried to say, look, we must work with the Russians to some extent, but there was no consensus in Washington. But today, there will be some opposition to Biden as well. But I think the sense, look, if the focus is on China, you've got to come to a settlement in Europe with Russia. This is not going to be easy. There will be a lot of opposition in Washington. The Republicans will surely oppose it. A lot of the Europeans who are next to Russia, they want NATO protection. Here is a problem. NATO can offer protection, but it can't really ensure it. Yeah. Do they really have the political will to fight Russia and Ukraine, which was part of Russia for centuries? So therefore, I think the West has realized, look, they need to cut a deal with Russia. And for Russia, this expanded and continuous confrontation with the West has also had costs. After all, a reasonable relationship with Europe and the US would put Russia in a very different place. But today, they're simply defying the West and trying to rely on China. So I think the exploration is, can there be a new settlement in Europe? But this is going to be quite hard to actually pull this off. But I think the Ukraine crisis, has forced West to reconsider. And for Putin, because Biden met him in June, and Biden seems to have signaled, look, he's preferred to look for a new relationship with Russia. So Russia is giving it a shot as well.
Everyone should read the column, and you take us through some of the history of the Cold War and the sort of New Delhi's position, pre-Cold War, Cold War, and of course, post the collapse of the Soviet Union. One of the things you said, which I found very interesting, was that how Delhi, India has a tendency to the foreign policy and national security had a tendency to over-determine the differences between Russia and the West. One of the tendencies that Delhi had was to over-determine these differences. That while there are, of course, ideological differences, even now, there is fundamentally national interest and trying to maximize opportunities. Do you think now there has been a tendency, at least in Delhi, if not in broader diplomatic circles in the West as well, to over-determine the degree to which Russia and China have come together? Because we saw now with the S-400 and S-500 missiles, it's not as though Russia doesn't want to do business with India in terms of, say, at least armaments, which are a traditional security aspect. Now that, say, Putin wants to have a greater accommodation with, or at least some kind of détente with the West in Europe, that this is also an opportunity to actually make sure that Russia and China don't form some kind of axis, which is, sometimes in this popular parlance. Do you think there's a tendency to just, are we over-determining the China-Russia thing at the moment? It may seem like it's a great alliance, but it's not as though it's like the relationship with Pakistan.
See, I think it's a good question, and it's a complicated one. I mean, for Russia, for all its alliance, which is pretty important with China at this point of time, because it sees China as a counter to the West, and they shared interest in fighting the West. But Russia is located in Europe. However much it has territories in Asia, Russia's history is really about being integral to Europe, and Russia's center of gravity is actually in Europe. Russia historically, its most populous parts are in Europe. And Russia was part of the European great power system. It's really the 1917 Russian Revolution that put an ideological tension between Russia and the Western Europe. And this tension did not get resolved in 1991 because there was no sustainable accommodation between the two sides in 1991. So I think for Russia, that it would want to be seen as equal to the Americans. It's still doing arms control, nuclear stuff. It doesn't want to be treated as some kind of as a minor power. And Russia also, I think Russia and China have had problems in the past. They were buddies at one point when Russia was communist, China was communist, and then they fell out. They've come together again. And China today is almost 10 times bigger than Russia in terms of its GDP. Therefore, for Russia, having a balanced relationship with both the West as well as with China will give it more room for maneuver. So I think at this point, Putin's strategy will be to see how much of a flexibility is there in the US positions. Can NATO actually negotiate with him? And if he can get a deal with the West, then his leverage vis-a-vis China will also go up. But this is, as I said, look, this is going to be a hard act to pull from both sides.
Yeah.
But I think they're giving it a shot.
Yeah. So one of the things that now India, of course, is we're still in terms of certainly defense, but in other major aspects, Russia is an important trading partner as well as a close historical partner. So how much do you think it's been tough for Delhi? I mean, we've been pulling off, in one sense, a pretty decent balancing act, Israel, Iran, to manage to have a certain degree of, US, Russia. Do you think that this is something that is sustainable? Like, if the conflict sharpens, there is always a chance of that. To what extent will India have to? So far, we're seeing as being closer to the US than in the past, but we certainly haven't abandoned Russia. And neither is Russia in that sense completely abandoned us despite being close to China. Do you see that getting tougher or easier for Delhi as time goes on? So far, it seems to have done a decent job.
Just a word about ideology, the Indian, I just wanted to address that point. Because of 1917, the Russian Revolution, and its impact on Indian national movement. So India came of age when Russia was an ideological power, and it was standing up against the West. And it seemed to coincide with India's anti-colonial struggle, Russia's anti-Western positions, gave it an ideological bent. And then after the independence, because of the Cold War's complications and its impact, US was aligned with Pakistan. Therefore, India drew closer to the Soviet Union. So I think, but we kept seeing Russia as if Russia's destiny is to oppose West. Yeah. But as I said, look, Russia wants to be part of the West. It's the question of terms of settlement. It's not a principle. Russia wants honorable terms to be part of the Europe. That's where Russia was before 1917. It wants to go back to being an element of the great power balance in Europe. So I think that's what they're trying to do, and I think we shouldn't assume that they're forever anti-Western, but they want a decent terms, which is what the leverage that they're trying for. For India, the whole question of look, can we pull this off? I mean, we have a fairly, we have a good relationship with Russia, we have even better relationship with the United States, and we're playing, except China, we have good relations with everyone, with Europe. But can this be sustained? But the problems are beginning. For example, on S-400 sale, the prospect for American sanctions. Americans right now, they're not going to do it. But tomorrow, if you buy another S-500 sale, or you buy some major Russian weapons which complicate life for the Americans, then I think it'll get tighter and tighter. And that's why India has a huge stake in a normal relationship between Russia and the West. If Russia and the West, get along with each other, which is what they seemed to get along in the 90s. So that gave us a chance to open up to everyone. Therefore, for India, would like to see US and Russia get along or have a reasonable accommodation. So that will reduce a lot of pressure on India and increase its room for maneuver. And second, if the focus shifts on to China and Russia is willing to be neutral in the question of balancing China, it's not going to be easy. Russians are going to get the maximum leverage for that. That too will help India to balance Asia, because you can't balance Asia if Russia is totally in league with the Chinese.
On that, because Russia is obviously now much closer to China than it is to India. But do you think there's something to be done in terms of just the old soft power connection, or the things India and Russia we used to have, certainly in the Soviet days, student exchanges, people-to-people contact to a much greater extent, cultural exchanges, things of that sort. As well as, of course, we have, our big advantage, the largest defense market, which is complicated, but also a market for other kinds of goods. Do you think there is something to be said for India to make India a little more indispensable, a little more important to Russia as well, without upsetting the strategic balance with the US too much?
No, I think we've lost quite a bit of that soft power thing with Russia. Trade has remained very stagnant, so there's not much of an economic content to the relationship. Second, because of the left, the communists, there was a whole popular attachment to the Soviet Union, and not just the ordinary students, but the kind of exchanges between the Indian Communist parties, the left, and the communist Russia was deep and kind of lasted for many decades. But today, Russia, as I said, they look towards the West and to China, because China has become a big partner. India is also looking to the West. So I think it's no longer that binding force of the kind that existed. What keeps it together is really Russia's desire to retain a measure of autonomy, to be able to have maximum number of options. And for India too, that is the option. So the people-to-people thing, we've really lost quite a bit. There's no B2B relationship, that is business to business, is stagnant. People-to-people has actually shrunk after the Soviet Union collapsed. So I think there is a lot of work to be done, and it can't be sustained purely on strategic calculations or purely on defense purchases. It needs a deeper depth. And I think when President Putin was in Delhi, they did talk about expanding economic cooperation. Hopefully, some of that will begin to transit.
Right. So thank you so much, everyone. This was just a very small aspect of the piece. I suggest everyone read it who's watching this video. It is, of course, on the IndianExpress.com, as well as there should be a link wherever you're watching this video in the description. Thank you so much, sir. We'll talk again next week.
Thank you, Akash.